It's the early morning hours of November 28, 1953 in New York City. Glass shatters high above 7th Avenue and a man plunges from a 10th floor window of the Statler Hotel, hitting the sidewalk with a terrible thud. A doorman rushes inside yelling, "We got a jumper!" The kind of panic no hotel manager ever wants to hear. The victim's name, as police soon learn, is Frank Olson, a 43-year-old government scientist. The CIA quickly informs Olson's family that he jumped to his death and suggests it was a tragic suicide during a mental breakdown. For decades, that was the official story, and Olson's distraught wife and 3 children could do little but accept it. The casket was kept closed at his funeral, allegedly because of the state of his body. Case closed, or so it seemed. Yet Olson's death would become one of the most timeless mysteries of the Cold War. Decades later, startling revelations cast his fatal plunge in a completely new light. Secrets began to come to light about shadowy CIA programs and bizarre experiments that Olson was involved in. The US government eventually admitted that just days before he died, Olson had been unwittingly drugged with LSD by CIA colleagues. Whispers grew that Olson knew the deepest, darkest secrets of the Cold War, and that he might have been murdered to keep those secrets hidden. Was Frank Olson a troubled man who jumped from a 10th floor window, or a CIA insider who knew too much? To see how we got to that suspicious hotel room tragedy, let's step back and see who Frank Olson was and what he got mixed up in. Frank Olson wasn't just any hotel guest. He was a US Army scientist turned CIA contractor, deeply embedded in the government's most clandestine research. Born in 1910, Olson earned a PhD in bacteriology and went to work during World War II on America's biological warfare projects. By the 1940s, he was based at Fort Detrick in Maryland, the Army's top-secret biological warfare laboratory. There, Olson and a handful of other specialists developed deadly aerosols and germs for use in war. He even helped create the handy-sized biological weapons disguised as everyday items, like shaving cream cans filled with lethal bacteria. In one test, Olson took part in Operation Sea Spray, releasing a cloud of microbes over San Francisco to study how germs might spread. This was cutting-edge, albeit dangerous science fueled by fears that the Soviet Union was racing to develop germ warfare as well. By the early 1950s, Olson's work brought him into the orbit of the newly formed Central Intelligence Agency. He became one of roughly 24 men who knew the full scope of Project MK-Ultra, the CIA's ultra-secret program of mind control. MK-Ultra was the agency's attempt to understand and weaponize the human mind, everything from hypnosis and electroshock to psychedelic drugs. The CIA was especially interested in LSD, the powerful hallucinogen, to see if it could act as a truth serum or mentally incapacitate our enemies. As a CIA insider with clearance tighter than tight, Frank Olson stood at the core of America's biological warfare and mind control efforts. It was a privileged position, but it also meant he was tangled up in some of the government's darkest operations. Friends later noted that Olson was an outspoken man, never afraid to say what he really thought, a trait that, in the secret world of CIA projects, made his superiors quite nervous. By 1953, Olson had begun to harbor deep misgivings about the work he was doing, especially after witnessing brutal interrogations and deadly experiments while overseas. In November 1953, just before Thanksgiving, Frank Olson walked into a gathering that would set the stage for his demise. He and several colleagues, a mix of CIA scientists and Army researchers, met at a cabin on Deep Creek Lake in rural Maryland for what was supposed to be a routine work retreat. Among those present were Olson's division chief, Vincent Rouet, and Sidney Gottlieb, the CIA's chief chemist and the MK-Ultra mastermind. Unbeknownst to Olson, Gottlieb had planned a covert experiment on the attendees. On the evening of November 19th, after dinner, the group relaxed with after-dinner drinks provided by Gottlieb's deputy, Robert Lashbrook. What no one realized until much later was that Lashbrook had spiked the bottle with LSD under Gottlieb's orders. As the men sipped their drinks, they began to feel strange. About 20 minutes in, Gottlieb bluntly asked if anyone was feeling odd, then revealed the truth. Their drinks had been dosed with LSD. The news was not well received. Even in their altered, hallucinatory state, the men grasped the betrayal. Frank Olson, in particular, reacted very badly. He became agitated and disoriented, unable to distinguish reality from fantasy. According to Olson's son, his father was quite confused and upset that his colleagues had secretly drugged him. Though the impromptu experiment soon dissolved into a night of drunken, psychedelic silliness, the damage to Olson's psyche was done. The next morning, the group broke up and Olson headed home to Fort Detrick, but colleagues immediately noticed a change in him. In the days following the LSD incident, Olson grew increasingly anxious, paranoid, and erratic. He had trouble sleeping and concentrating, even forgetting how to spell ordinary words. Days later, Olson and his boss, Rouet, were still visibly shaken by the experience. Rouet would later call it the most frightening ordeal he ever had. Olson began voicing grave doubts about the work they were doing. He told Rouet that he was considering quitting and even asked if Rouet thought he should be fired. Rouet, alarmed, managed to calm Olson down for the moment, convincing him not to make any hasty decisions. But Olson's mental state was spiraling. He had said to his wife, Alice, that he'd made a terrible mistake, though he didn't clarify what he meant. Those were chilling words in hindsight, and Alice Olson would never find out exactly what he meant by that admission. Olson's talk of leaving the CIA, combined with his disturbed behavior, set off alarm bells among his colleagues. Here was a man who knew almost all the CIA's secret projects in germ warfare and mind control, and he was now emotionally unstable and talking about walking away. In the hyper-secret world of MK Ultra, Frank Olson was fast becoming a security risk. As Olson's condition worsened, his superiors decided to take action, ostensibly to get him help, but perhaps also to keep him under watch. CIA chemist Sidney Gottlieb arranged for Olson to meet with a New York doctor named Harold Abramson, who was not a psychiatrist but was deeply involved in MK Ultra experiments. Abramson had the required security clearance, meaning Olson could speak freely about classified work during therapy. On November 24th, Olson traveled to New York, accompanied by his colleague Robert Lashbrook, the very same man who had slipped him the LSD, and by his boss, Rouet. Over a couple days, Olson met with Dr. Abramson, who noted that Frank was extremely distressed, unable to work, unable to sleep, and suffering from memory lapses. Abramson recommended that Olson consider checking into a sanatorium for a while to recuperate. Frank Olson agreed. In fact, by November 27th, he seemed relieved at the idea of a rest cure. That evening over dinner, Olson told Lashbrook he was looking forward to his hospitalization, even chatting about what books he might finally have time to read. Lashbrook later recalled that Olson appeared almost back to his old self, almost the Dr. Olson I knew before the experiment, he said. But in the early hours of the very next morning, tragedy struck. Frank Olson and Robert Lashbrook had checked into room 1018A at the Statler Hotel in Manhattan on November 27th. Sometime around 2:25 a.m. on the 28th, Frank Olson crashed through the closed window of 1018A, plunging 10 floors down to the street. Lashbrook was the only eyewitness. He claimed he had been asleep and was jolted awake by the sound of breaking glass, just in time to see Olson's body falling away into the night. It was an almost unbelievable scene. Olson, clad only in his underwear, had somehow run across the dark hotel room and leapt headfirst through a closed window with the shades and curtains drawn. Even the hotel's night manager was baffled. In all his years, he said, he'd never heard of a man getting up from bed and diving through a sealed window in the dark. The immediate assumption by police was that it was suicide, albeit a very odd one. Frank Olson was dead on the sidewalk, and Lashbrook, shaken and alone, was soon greeted by CIA security men who swept in to control the situation. The CIA moved quickly to contain the fallout. Agents from the CIA's security office descended on the Statler Hotel within hours of Olson's death. One CIA officer, using the cover name James MC, arrived to take charge. Years later, he was revealed as James McCord, who, in an ironic twist, would gain infamy as one of the Watergate burglars. The agency's priority was to craft a cover story and keep their own role hidden. The New York police were quietly persuaded not to investigate too deeply, and the sole witness, Lashbrook, was given a fake identity as an ordinary Department of Defense scientist. Olson's family in Maryland was notified that Frank had died in an accident with vague details, and they were discouraged from viewing his body. The official report simply stated that Olson perished from multiple fractures due to a jump or fall. The case was closed as a tragic suicide. For the CIA in 1953, the crisis had been managed, but in truth, the mystery of room 1018A was only just beginning. For over 20 years, the Olson family had no idea there was more to the story. They struggled to accept Frank's death as an inexplicable suicide, with no satisfying explanation for why he would have taken his own life. Then in 1975, the dam of secrecy broke. A series of government investigations, including the Rockefeller Commission report, exposed some of the CIA's darkest Cold War projects. Among the bombshell revelations, the CIA admitted that an Army scientist, now clearly identifiable as Frank Olson, had been drugged with LSD without his knowledge shortly before his death. On June 11, 1975, the Washington Post ran a front-page story about Olson's bizarre demise, and the news spread like wildfire. After decades of silence, the Olson family suddenly learned that Frank's fatal nervous breakdown might not have been a spontaneous psychosis at all, but rather the result of a top-secret mind control experiment gone awry. The Olson family was stunned and furious. They held a press conference, sitting in their own backyard, to tell the world that they felt deceived by their own government. Frank's widow Alice told reporters that her husband had not acted irrational or sick in his final days, though he was very melancholy and had said he was going to leave his job. She announced the family's intent to sue the CIA for wrongful death, seeking answers and compensation. This threat of a public lawsuit deeply worried officials in Washington. A court case could force the CIA to disclose even more highly classified information, as White House aide and future Vice President Dick Cheney warned in a memo at the time. The Ford administration moved quickly to quell the scandal. In an unprecedented gesture, President Gerald Ford personally invited Alice Olson and her children to the White House, and on July 21, 1975, he formally apologized to them in the Oval Office on behalf of the U.S. government. It was the first time an American president had ever apologized to the family of a CIA officer who died in covert circumstances. The CIA director, William Colby, also met with the Olsons and admitted that the agency had done a terrible thing that should never have happened. Behind closed doors, White House lawyers offered the family a financial settlement to prevent a lawsuit, ultimately $750,000, about $3.8 million in today's money, in exchange for the Olsons dropping their legal claims. After some hesitation, the Olsons accepted the payment, and Congress passed a bill to make it official. By 1976, Frank Olson's case was, at least legally, put to rest. Or was it? Despite the apologies and the payout, many troubling questions remained unanswered. The government's 1975 explanation painted Olson's death as a sort of LSD accident. The narrative was that Olson had a bad trip and killed himself while in a disturbed state. But to Olson's sons, Eric and Nils, that story just didn't add up. Frank Olson had been a seasoned scientist and patriotic Army officer, not someone prone to sudden irrational acts. Why would a brief drug experiment drive him to dive out of a window 9 days later? And what about the other ominous hints? His talk of quitting, his statement about a mistake, and the CIA's frantic cover-up. As the years passed, the Olson brothers continued quietly searching for the full truth, unwilling to let their father's story be simply written off as a footnote of Project MKUltra. In the absence of clear answers, a multitude of conspiracy theories and suspicions have swirled around Frank Olson's death. One theory suggests that Olson was murdered by the CIA, not because of the LSD experiment per se, but because he knew too much and was viewed as a potential whistleblower. Remember, by late 1953, Olson had become deeply unsettled by parts of his work. It's documented that earlier that year he had witnessed horrific interrogations at CIA safe houses in Germany, where suspected spies and prisoners were subjected to extreme interrogation techniques combining drugs, hypnosis, and torture. Olson had also been present at top-secret tests of deadly nerve gas in Britain and saw other classified abuses that weighed on his conscience. A British psychiatrist who spoke with Olson that year reported that he seemed deeply disturbed by what he had seen and was showing symptoms of not wanting to keep secret those horrific events. In other words, Frank Olson was exactly the kind of guy who might talk. At least that's what some in the CIA may have feared. One of Olson's friends and colleagues later said that Frank was very open, pulled no punches, and that was exactly what they were scared of. Could it be that Olson's strange death was a preemptive silencing? It isn't as far-fetched as it might sound. In fact, Eric Olson eventually pointed out a line from a 1950 CIA manual on assassination. The most efficient accident is a fall of 75 feet or more onto a hard surface. Frank Olson fell approximately 150 feet onto a New York City sidewalk. The suspicious circumstances at the Statler Hotel have never been fully explained. Even a veteran New York prosecutor, Stephen Sirocco, who reviewed the case decades later, noted that if this were a suicide, it would have been very difficult to accomplish given the layout of that hotel room. He plainly stated Olson had motive to be killed. He knew the deepest, darkest secrets of the Cold War, he said. Would the government kill an American scientist if they thought he was a security risk? There are people who say, definitely. Over the years, independent investigators and journalists have kept the Olson case alive as a haunting example of a Cold War mystery. The CIA's admission in 1975 that it drugged Olson provided a piece of the puzzle, but conspiracy researchers argue it might have also been a convenient, limited hangout, or a partial truth told to hide a bigger truth. If all focus was on the LSD, perhaps fewer questions would be asked about the other things Olson knew, like biological warfare in Korea. Notably, Olson had been involved in the Army's germ warfare program during the Korean War, and some believe he had knowledge about alleged U.S. use of bioweapons in that conflict. The U.S. government has always denied using such weapons, but it was a major accusation by the Soviet Union and China at that time. Eric Olson has come to believe his father did not die because he was an experimental guinea pig who had a bad trip. Instead, he asserts, Frank Olson died because of concern that he would divulge information about CIA interrogation programs and biological warfare secrets. In short, the theory is that Frank Olson was eliminated by his own people under the cover of a suicide. On the other hand, skeptics of the murder theory caution that we may never know for sure what happened, and hard evidence is scarce. It's possible that Olson's death was a suicide or a tragic accident stemming from his mental breakdown, aggravated by the reckless LSD experiment. The timing, 9 days later, and the manner are unusual, but mental health crises can manifest in unpredictable ways. At the time, LSD's effects were not well understood, and Olson had reportedly been anxious and depressive in the days before his death. One contemporary account from the CIA's perspective suggested the Deep Creek Lake experiment was meant to test if a scientist might divulge secrets under the influence of drugs. Perhaps Olson's guilt and paranoia after that test simply overwhelmed him. The truth might lie in a gray area, a mentally shattered man and a spooked CIA, a combination that ended in tragedy. Unsatisfied with speculation, Frank Olson's family saw concrete evidence. In 1994, over 40 years after his death, they took the dramatic step of exhuming Frank Olson's body for a second autopsy. Forensic pathologist James Starrs led the examination, looking for any forensic clues that the original 1953 investigation might have missed or buried. The results were eye-opening. Starrs found no shards of glass on Olson's head or neck, an odd finding if Olson had truly dove headfirst through a closed window. Even more telling, Starrs' team discovered a large hematoma on the side of Olson's skull above his left eye, as well as a significant chest injury that did not seem consistent with the pattern of injuries from a simple fall. Given that Olson reportedly landed on his back, the head wound was puzzling. It suggested Frank Olson might have been knocked unconscious or injured before he went out the window. After careful study, the majority of the forensic team concluded that the blunt force trauma to Olson's head and chest likely occurred prior to the fall, not as a result of it. Professor Starrs stated the evidence was rankly and starkly suggestive of homicide. He later went even further, saying, "I think Frank Olson was intentionally, deliberately thrown out of that window." This autopsy finding was a bombshell. It didn't prove murder with absolute certainty, but it lent significant credence to the Olson family's suspicions. The case was reopened by the New York District Attorney's Office in the mid-1990s. Stephen Sirocco, the assistant DA, gathered evidence and even deposed Robert Lashbrook as part of a cold case inquiry. In the end, prosecutors felt they didn't have enough definitive proof to bring murder charges or convene a grand jury. The Olson family, having signed the 1976 settlement, also faced legal barriers in suing again. A federal judge dismissed a new lawsuit they filed in 2012, partly because of the earlier settlement exempted the government from further liability. Still, even that judge acknowledged that the public record supports many of the allegations, far-fetched as they may sound. In other words, Olson's story, incredible as it is, rings true in many respects. In recent years, the Olson case has seeped further into popular culture, with documentaries like the Netflix series Wormwood, and books re-examining the evidence and the theories. The Olson brothers have devoted much of their adult lives to finding closure. In 2002, Eric Olson held a press conference as they prepared to rebury their father's remains. He said clearly, "The death of Frank Olson was a murder, not a suicide," and urged people not to be misled by the simplified LSD accident story. According to Eric, his father died because CIA officials were afraid of what he might reveal about ultra-secret programs, and that will always cast a shadow of doubt over the official story. More than 70 years later, the Frank Olson case remains a chilling puzzle and a cautionary tale about government secrecy. We know for a fact that the CIA engaged in outrageous experiments like dosing their own personnel with LSD. Olson's story forced the U.S. to admit as much in the 1970s. We also know that the CIA's initial handling of Olson's death was deceptive. They concealed key facts and likely destroyed records. What we don't know for sure is exactly what happened in room 1018A in those early morning hours. Did Frank Olson, in a moment of drug-induced delirium or despair, choose to leap to his own death? Or was he, as his family believes, pushed to his death by someone, a victim of the very national security apparatus he served? The evidence gathered, especially the second autopsy's findings of a likely pre-fall injury, certainly leans towards foul play. Yet in the murky world of covert operations, absolute proof is hard to come by. In a broader sense, Frank Olson's strange death begs the question of how far a government might go to protect its secrets. The Cold War produced countless dark secrets and moral compromises. Olson's fate, whether suicide or murder, came directly from that shadowy realm of mind control experiments and biological warfare research. As one observer aptly put it, Olson knew the deepest, darkest secrets of the Cold War, and that raises an uncomfortable question. Would the US government kill one of its own scientists if it feared he might talk? Some people, including Olson's own family, firmly believe the answer is yes. Others may remain skeptical, but the very fact that such a question can be seriously asked shows how badly trust was broken by projects like MKUltra. In the end, the mystery of Frank Olson's death lives on as a sobering real-life thriller, a story with heroes and villains, science and paranoia, truth and deception all entangled. Frank Olson went to his grave with his secrets, but his story has shined a light on the extreme lengths governments might go in the name of national security. We may never get a definitive answer about what truly happened that night in 1953, but the case of Frank Olson reminds us that government secrets have a way of coming back to haunt, and that sometimes the official explanation only scratches the surface of a much stranger reality. The next time you hear a story that sounds like a Hollywood spy thriller, secret experiments, mystery deaths, cover-ups, remember, it just might be true. Frank Olson's family is still living with that truth, and the rest of us are left to wonder what really happened behind the drawn shades of room 1018A.